During the mid-1940s, post-war Los Angeles was a luxury bazaar for the rich and famous, with Hollywood starlets, powerful lawyers, and influential artists each enjoying the sordid pleasures of the city of sin. Scandal, corruption, and vice were rampant from the lowest rungs of society to the very top of the political hierarchy. But the City of Angels would also serve as a hedonistic playground for psychopaths, mobsters, and elusive serial killers. In one of the most famous cities in the world, murder became commonplace, and the streets of Los Angeles proved to be a dangerous place for young women. In November 1944, the bodies of two women were found in separate hotels, brutally slain just several hours apart. The Lily Ripper committed unspeakable acts against his victims. The murder of Elizabeth Short in January 1947 was a crime that shocked the nation. A little more than 3 weeks later, the naked body of a second victim was found discarded on the sidewalk. This victim, Jeanne French, had been horrifically murdered, the killer having stomped her to death. Many suspected that a serial murderer was responsible for this crime, which became known as the Red Lipstick Murder, when the mutilated body of Elizabeth Short was found dumped on a vacant lot on the west side of South Norton Avenue. Newspapers nicknamed her the Black Dahlia, synonymous with mystery, intrigue, and death. Her killer was never caught. At around 8 a.m. on the morning of February 10, 1947, construction worker H.C. Shelby was making his way to work when he noticed what appeared to be a pile of women's clothing among some weeds in a field not far from the nearby sidewalk. He decided to investigate further, and as he neared this odd sight and lifted a coat with a fur trim, Shelby found the naked body of Jeanne French. She had been brutally beaten. Her skull had been smashed several times with a blunt metal weapon, most likely a socket wrench, but this wasn't what struck the fatal blow that killed Jeanne. After the vicious bludgeoning, the murderer inflicted further blows by sadistically stomping on the unconscious victim's body until she died. When police examined her body, it was covered with cuts, bruising, and other internal wounds that caused Jeanne French to bleed slowly. But the marks of her beating were not the only thing the killer had on her body. As she died, the killer removed Jeanne's lipstick from her purse and wrote a message across her torso. The name Tex was also scrawled in red handwriting. At the time, the press had misreported the message, with many believing the words read BD, despite the coroner's confirmation. When the letters BD became public knowledge, many familiar with the Black Dahlia case suspected a link, believing the message was a direct reference to the murder of Elizabeth Short. Rumors soon began to circulate that these two murders were committed by the same person. The consensus, however, is that the message contained the letter PD and was most likely an insult directed toward the LA Police Department. One possible theory centers on the notion that PD refers to someone's initials and that Tex is short for Texas. But without any further clues on the victim, it was impossible to confirm any theories put forward by detectives. The evidence they did have was left on the victim's body, so police attempted to find out everything they could about 44-year-old Jeanne French. Jeanne French was born Jean Nettie Axford on October 6, 1902. Very little is known about her early life, but records indicate Axford family moved to Oklahoma and that Jeanne had 5 younger siblings: Charles, Clinton, Roy, Mark, and Charloma. Tragically, 2 of her siblings appear to have died at young ages. Charles Axford was just 11 when he passed away in 1915, and Frances was even younger, aged just 6 years old in 1920. It is known that at 18 years of age, she would marry for the first time. David Yandell Rather, a wealthy oilman from Amarillo, Texas, became her first husband. In 1920, the couple welcomed their first and only child, a son they named David after his father. Jeanne worked as a nurse at St. Anthony's Hospital. However, by 1924, the couple's marriage encountered problems, and the pair were soon separated. After the divorce, Jeanne took her 4-year-old son, and together the two moved to Los Angeles. It was there, in 1925, that she would meet and marry her second husband, David Thomas. The couple wed on May 3, 1925, but once again, the marriage was short-lived. She continued to work as a nurse and was soon part of a team of nurses working with a Colombian oil company. While flying with the company, Jeanne became fascinated with exploring the skies. She soon decided to quit nursing and began to study aviation. After passing her pilot's exam, she became a member of the Women's Air Reserve and the International Organization of Women Pilots, or the 99 Club, as they are also known. By 1931, she was using the name Jeanne Axford Thomas and had gained fame and success as a pilot, even earning the nickname the Flying Nurse. On October 26, 1931, she married for the third time. Her new husband, Curtis Perry Bauer, was also a pilot. This third marriage also failed, and the couple separated after just 5 weeks of marriage. Little documentation exists about the next few years of Jeanne French's life, but she may have traveled and lived a socialite lifestyle with her friend. It has also been reported, albeit without proof, that she had several minor acting roles under Jeanne Axford Thomas. Jeanne would marry for a fourth time on December 30th, 1944, to her last husband, serviceman Frank French. This marriage also experienced problems, specifically when Jeanne started to turn to drink frequently, the reason for which is unclear. When intoxicated, Jeanne would often become aggressive and abusive. 2 years later, in 1947, the pair would separate. Although the murder of Elizabeth Short had occurred just 3 weeks prior, police did not think the same individual committed these two murders. They believed they were looking for two separate killers. Investigators instead turned their attention to the most obvious suspect, the victim's estranged husband, Frank French. The couple had a particularly volatile relationship, with violence from both against the other. Shortly before Jeanne's murder, Frank had been arrested after he had punched Jeanne in the face during one terrible argument. It was also learned that in the hours before her murder, Jeanne had visited her husband's apartment. She arrived intoxicated, and soon enough, as had become familiar, the couple began arguing on the front porch. The encounter reportedly ended with Jeanne hitting Frank with her purse before leaving. Frank was arrested, and although he admitted to Jeanne visiting him at his apartment, he was adamant that was the last time he had seen her. Officers of the LAPD made French take a lie detector test. He passed. Frank also claimed that his landlady could confirm his alibi that he didn't leave his flat that evening. Jeanne's 25-year-old son, David, was also brought in for questioning. They could find no evidence to tie her murder to Frank. When questioned, Frank's landlady did confirm his alibi, stating that she hadn't seen him leave his flat the evening of the murder. Finally, investigators failed to match the shoe prints found at the murder scene to Frank. The shoe imprints left at the location of the crime were of a small men's size 6 or 7 shoes. LAPD detectives then tried to locate a man who was seen with Jeanne the hours before her death. Eyewitnesses described the man seen with Jeanne in the Pan American Bar in West Washington Place as a small man with a dark complexion. The bartender working on the night of the murder said that the pair had left together. He was almost certainly her killer. Unfortunately, police were unable to trace the individual in question. Detectives next tried to find Jeanne French's car, which they could locate in a parking lot, but they had few leads. Witnesses said the vehicle had been there since around 3:00 a.m. on the morning of the murder. A night watchman, who was one of the witnesses to come forward, claimed that an unidentified man had left the car at the scene. Again, this man was never identified or traced. And the case of the red lipstick murder soon went cold. It would be 3 years before the murder of Jeanne French would garner public attention once more. The murders of Gertrude Landon, Elizabeth Short, Louise Sprinter, Gladys Kern, Laura Trelstad, Dorothy Montgomery, and Jeanne French were all high-profile. In November 1946, 4 months before her brutal murder, while she was still living with her husband Frank, the couple hired a painter named George Witt to work on their home. Investigators learned that Jeanne and Witt soon started an affair, with Witt admitting to going on several dates with Jeanne. They discovered that the painter had burned some clothing and several pairs of shoes around the time of the murder. When asked why, Witt reportedly said he did this because he feared he would be suspected of the murder of Jeanne French. However, despite looking like a promising suspect, George Witt was seemingly able to provide a solid alibi and prove he wasn't the killer. Further investigation uncovered another man in Jeanne French's life. Police found that she had been sharing a post office box with an unknown male while using a name from a previous marriage, Jean Thomas. The victim had been receiving letters at the Palms Postal Station in West Los Angeles, but despite an appeal for the man to come forward, no one ever did. One suspect, Dr. George Hodel, was first proposed by his son, Steve Hodel, the author of the book Black Dahlia Avenger, a genius for murder, in which Hodel points the finger at his father for the murder of Elizabeth Short. Hodel also believes his father is responsible for killing several other women, including Georgette Bauerdorf, Jeanne Spangler, and Jeanne French. It is Hodel's belief that these murders and others are all connected to his father. Steve Hodel claims that the murder of French was a message to the police after it was reported in the press that they had arrested a suspect for the murder of Elizabeth Short. In his opinion, Dr. George Hodel murdered Jeanne French and left the initials BD on her body to warn police that it was the same killer. This, of course, ignores the fact that the coroner clearly stated the initials written were PD and not BD, and that it was more likely the killer was sending a message directly to the police with the words, "Screw you, PD." It was apparent the killer held some grudge against law enforcement. However, Dr. Hodel's problems with the LAPD did not start until 1949, 2 years after the murders, when he was arrested on suspicion of incest with his 14-year-old daughter, Tamar Hodel, who claimed her father impregnated her and then forced her to undergo a back-alley abortion. After this, Hodel came to the attention of detectives investigating the Black Dahlia murder, and he soon became the prime suspect based on the belief that a doctor had committed the gruesome crime. George Hodel has been proposed as the killer of many LA women. However, there is little proof that he committed the brutal slaying. The murder of Jeanne French remains unsolved,